Good evening and welcome to the March edition of the Austin Software Cooperatives meetup. We're going to be doing a review part three of a preface to an economic democracy by Robert Dahl. There's going to be a mind map, and I'm glad that you could join us. Let's get started here. So we're in chapter three. It's democracy and the economic order. So to start out, there are five goals that they were concentrating on for the uh, for this chapter. I think this part here kind of summarizes it pretty good. So we wish to achieve political equality. So we insist that our economic order must help to bring about these values, right? So political equality, the democratic process, and primary political rights. We're gonna delve more into these. So, and in this chapter, he's going to be comparing different economic orders. So, one of them being corporate capitalism. And he's putting forth this this summary. The best economic order would help to generate a distribution of political resources favorable to the goals of voting equality, effective participation, enlightened understanding, and the final control of the political agenda by all adults subject to the laws. Right? So that this part here, the best economic order, that is the key. We're going to be comparing economic orders. All right. So if we had no other ends than the democratic process, then the requirements of that process would quite properly completely dominate our thinking about the economic order. But we may reasonably demand that our economic order also be just, right? So uh, we're basically, again, comparing different economic models. Political equality is a form of distributed justice, right? And so, if you can remember from the previous chapters and reviews, where it really comes up to comes down to a really kind of a trade off between political equality and economic freedom. And he's going to be taking some of the arguments we received previous about any type of group that kind of has that forms, there's some kind of ethical underpinning that that group should have the right for self-determination, and that self-determination expresses itself the best in the democratic process. So when we look at the American um, I guess economic models, it we can see that there's the economic model is basically an authoritarian structure for the most part. So trying to reason about this and seeing, oh, is there another model that could retain all the good things, and we're going to talk about what the good things are, and then yet uh allow for political equality, right? More political equality. So the argument kind of being, or the assumption being, that we're having more political inequality. So we're going to talk about all those things. So democracy, political equality, and the protection of primary political rights are necessary for a just distribution of authority, right? This here being a concern. Should there be a just distribution of authority? Why would we want that? It may sound strange if you basically grew up in a society where when you go to work, it's no longer there's no distribution of authority. It's a hierarchy. It could be that you may think there's no other way, right? So among the spheres to which requirements of justice apply, of course, is the distribution of economic resources. That is economic fairness, right? So let's dig more into this. We should also insist that our economic order be efficient and that it would tend to minimize the ratio of valued inputs to valued outputs. For if it was inefficient, then we would needlessly squander our scarce resources and so live more poorly than we need, which is irrational. Okay, so this is essentially saying if we ponder another economic order, it needs to um, not needlessly leave things on the table. It needs to be efficient. So, one way to think of that is uh, cake cutting in the field of um, um, distributed justice and fairness. There is a concept called cake cutting. If there's two players or three players and you have a cake and you need to divide the cake among them, you could have there's different ways. You can have one person cut the cake and then the other two choose, right? And so if the person that cuts the cake is incentivized to cut it as evenly as possible because they're going to pick last. So the idea would be everyone else are going to pick the bigger pieces and then that person would be left with the smaller piece, so they better make it as even as possible. There's other forms of cake cutting, but those are called mechanisms. Well, whatever mechanism you come up with, there should be no mechanism where, given everyone's hungry, everyone wants as much cake as possible. There should be no mechanism where there's a piece that's just left there and people don't get to eat it. It would be better if there were uh, um, 5 pieces of cake and there were 4 people. It would be better. And then or four, somehow your mechanism sliced it to where there's only four, where the yeah, so where there's 5 pieces, but even though there's for 4 people, it'd be better that one person gets 2 slices than there be and it be uneven the distribution than to have no one get it. So that's efficiency. It's prioritizing over um, proportionality and other things. So that's what that's saying. Most important part of excellence, which any form of government can possess, is to promote the virtue and intelligence of the people themselves. Okay, so this is a reoccurring theme in democracy and political science over and over again. Is there's a whole view that the whole or one of the main tenets or purposes of government is to bestow virtue. And I think this goes back to like Aristotle and Plato, um, to try to bring or make the citizenry more virtuous or to lure them into being more virtuous or something like that. And so we're going to have the philosophers John Stuart Mill and Jacques Rousseau uh, come up with the arguments for um, whatever government that you put forth or propose, it needs to allow for and promote people to become virtuous and intelligent, these types of things, and being good citizens. All right. Why is that important? Well, if you come up with a government and an economic model that allows people or promotes people to be virtuous, to participate more, these types of things, that all things being equal is going to be better than a model that doesn't do that. All right. Next, um, each of us has many other fundamental interests, goals, desires, wants, values, and economic order that allow us to achieve our various goals. In this sense, expand our freedom would be better than one that prevented us from doing so. In our economic order, therefore, we want each of us to be free to acquire whatever economic resources are necessary, and so far as possible, sufficient to advance and protect all our fundamental interests, or if you like, the economic resources necessary for a good life. And we could call these personal economic resources, right? So we're talking about economic freedom now, right? And we want people to be kind of have maximal freedom that doesn't restrain others. So it would seem clear that we must have a right to gain access to adequate personal economic resources. This right may be what we mean when we use expression like economic freedom and economic liberty. At a minimum, the right to economic freedom would guarantee a negative freedom. That is, no one would have the right to prevent any other person from exercising the right to acquire personal economic resources whenever an opportunity exists. Right. So that's basically, you can maximize your freedom, but you can't hurt someone else. That's the limit. That's the boundary. So, in brief, we would search for an economic order that would decentralize many significant decisions among relatively autonomous economic enterprises, which would operate within limits set by a system of markets and such democratically imposed laws, rules, and regulations as may believe that are necessary to achieve our goals. Such decentralization will require significant authority to make important decisions to be exercised within firms. So this is kind of the overview or framework of trying to judge economic models. You got on the one side, we know we want freedom. Why do we want we want economic freedom, we want efficiency in the models, and we also want political equality. There's a push for all of that. I'll go ahead and say, like, Americans really, really value efficiency when it comes down to distributed justice and fair division. Efficiency is one of the principles within, you know, five or six principles within dividing, um, and allocating resources fairly. We really, of all things, being equal, or we can't figure it out, we just say, okay, whatever's the most efficient. So nothing left on the table. You can think of it that way. We have that, and so now we got to dig into the different forms of these models. Any questions so far? I'm going to keep going. So the sketch of an alternative. Now we're going to talk about alternatives to the basically corporate capitalism. So one crucially important feature of self-governing enterprises is that they satisfy the criterion of voting equality. Hence, each person employed in an enterprise is entitled to one and only one vote. Systems of this kind have been called worker cooperatives, or examples of self management, or industrial democracy, but I prefer the term self governing enterprises. So he's putting forth worker cooperatives, and he calls them self governing enterprises. Why? Well, that political equality, the arguments that received from previous portions of the book, and arguing that a political equality should be pushed forward as much as possible, uh, it's valued higher in the worker cooperatives, and it's exemplified more there. right? Such a system of self-governing enterprises should not be confused with others, right? So he's going to talk about here that worker cooperatives, or there are different initiatives to try to maybe delegate things inside of a corporate structure, but they don't really meet the criteria that he was saying earlier of voting equality. So he's going to list some of them here. Self-governing enterprises should not be confused with others that it might vaguely or closely resemble. Obviously, self-governing enterprises only remotely resemble pseudo-democratic schemes of employee consultation by management, schemes of limited employee participation that leave all the crucial decisions with management elected by stockholders, or employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs, that are created only or primarily to provide corporations with low interest loans, low corporate income taxes, greater cash flow, and employee pension funds, or a market for their stock, right? So this is a critique of different schemes, he's calling them, of firms and activity within firms that try to say that they're doing something democratic, but it's not one person, one vote. So if it's not one person, one vote, then these are pseudo democratic schemes and they don't have political equality, so they don't count. He's not counting those. So while self-governing enterprises may prove to have several advantages over not only the typical stockholder owned and management controlled corporation, but publicly owned and hierarchically run firms, the justification most relevant here is the contribution they might make to the values of justice and democracy, right? So when we're talking about self-governing enterprises, if they were as efficient as present firms, and if they did not diminish fundamental liberties, and if at the same time they were superior in their consequences for democracy and justice, then they would definitely be better. What consequences for democracy and justice could we reasonably expect from a system of self-governing enterprises? And we need to talk about that. But he's saying all things being equal, because democratically run firms uh, have are superior in their consequences for democracy and justice, they're better. So we're talking about political equality and the strong arguments supporting prioritizing political equality. So now we need to, these are his two arguments. His two arguments are based on, as far as democratic values, that democracy within firms would improve the quality of democracy in the government of the state by transforming us into better citizens by facilitating greater political equality among us. Right. So that's one type of argument. Improve the quality of democracy in the government of the state by transforming us. So this is a Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill side argument, right? Facilitating greater political equality. Now, the other type of argument is, if democracy is justified in the government of our state, then it's also justified in the governments that make decisions within firms, right? So he's doing um that's almost like a logical syllogism. If democracy is justified in the government of our state, then it is also justified in the governments that make decisions with our firms. He's relying that you already believe that democracy is justified in the government of our state. So then it follows that it's also justified. So it would be he's trying to get this first premise that's going to be the rest of this chapter and the next chapter, really. So, any questions so far? Comments? All right, let's move. So, that sketch of an alternative ends up being cooperatives. Now, we're going to talk about democratic citizens through participatory democracy. Self government in economic enterprises is often advocated as a way of creating participatory democracy and producing changes in human personalities and behavior that it is said participation will bring about. The idea of the polis is transferred to the workplace, and the enterprise becomes a site for fulfilling Rousseau's vision of political society. What does that mean? Basically, that we are going to be better citizens. We're going to because we participate more in being governed in the government, and so it's going to be kind of like a feedback loop. The government's going to be better because we're a part of it, and we're learning more as we participate. That kind of thing. So now he's going to get into some of these. There's some there's some studies for and some studies against participatory democracy. Now we reviewed a book about participatory democracy. So some of this is a review. So he's saying here they're against the findings, right? Against the findings that you would kind of think, oh, participation is going to make people have more virtue, be more intelligent in government. There's some findings against it. So, however, some support at least modest expectations for positive changes. Okay, I think I missed. I didn't go all the way. Okay, yeah. Here we go. Here we go. Workplace democracy, it is sometimes claimed, will foster human development and enhance the sense of political efficacy, reduce alienation, create a solidarity or solidarity community based on work, strengthen attachments to the general good of the community, weaken the pull of self-interest, produce a body of active and concerns public spirited citizens within an enterprise, and stimulate greater participation and better citizenship in the government of the state itself. The evidence is incomplete. So this is what I was talking about. It's and mixed, right? In a study of Los Angeles high fidelity equipment manufacturing firm with about 1,000 people, um, the introduction of a planning council and a number of special committees, work teams, all of which greatly increased opportunities for participation in decisions, led over a 14-month period to only a modest increase in average participation. Increased participation by activists did not reduce their alienation from work. In fact, the alienation decreased for participation in the work teams and an increase for participants on the planning council and special committees. So this we saw some of this in the other book too. So people who are activists like trying to get people to participate in an organization in in a cooperative or whatever, those people actually have it has a negative effect. It makes them feel more alienated, supposedly, because it they are seeing how the sausage is made. They're seeing a lot of people not participating, not wanting to participate, being complacent, and it has an effect on them. Neither new opportunities for participation nor participation itself brought about an increase in support for participation. Support actually declined among activists, partly because of the disenchantment felt by the same council members at the apparent apathy of their fellow workers. So this is a reoccurring theme in the in democracy. Lots of apathy. There's one thing you can bet on if you have a democracy is there's going to be a great deal of apathy, people not participating. So it's the name of the game is trying to figure out how to get more. Here's another example. Oh, same kind of thing. With another uh, cooperative, actually, right? So the expectation held by many theorists of industrial democracy that self-managed work environments might serve to nurture feelings of cooperation, equality, generosity, and self-confidence in one's fellows is only partly met within the plywood cooperatives. The expectation that such feelings would spill over the walls of the workplace so as to incorporate society, economy, and government is decidedly not met, right? So that whole dream within these studies of John Stuart Mill and Rousseau of people participating in a government and it making them better, it didn't happen here. Now they're also gonna okay, so he also talks about Yugoslavia and there was also, talking about alienation again. Participants in self-management are more alienated than non-participants. Possibly for these workers, the direct experience with self-management has been so frustrating that their sense of alienation has become even greater. So that was experience in um, parts of Yugoslavia. So, having said that, there are some studies that support at least modest expectations for positive changes. So, one the conclusion was that workplace democracy increased satisfaction, personal growth, and satisfaction with opportunities for self management. These changes, in turn, increased political efficacy and social participation. So, this is kind of the opposite of what we've seen before, right? But it's focusing on satisfaction, personal growth, and satisfaction with opportunities for self management. Such evidence as we now have it does not, I think, warrant high hopes for huge changes in attitudes, values, and character for greater democracy at work. It should be said, however, that all the present evidence is very short term, since it's derived from studies of workers who are already fully formed by their society. All right. So basically, to summarize that portion, saying that people involved with a democracy at work don't look at them like there isn't enough evidence to say that they're going to be better citizens when they leave. This is his finding um, from what he was looking at. But there are some positive properties uh, for people who are engaged that are actually engaged, not in activism, but in the decision making at work. They have increases in satisfaction and personal growth in these types of things. Um, so there you go. So this, let me before I go into this next section, just ask if there's any questions or comments. All right. So moral responsibility is a big uh thrust of the argument. I think these are stronger for arguing that political equality should be strived for and prioritized within the workplace. I think these are stronger than the arguments for being a good citizen kind of thing. So, moral responsibility. Although the consequences for democratic character are problematical, a system of self governing enterprises does promise one change of some importance for the quality of a people. Complexity and gigantism have created such a distance between our actions and our consequences that our capacity for moral action has been dangerously impoverished. All right. Moral action requires an opportunity and a capacity for understanding the consequences of one's actions and for assuming responsibility for those consequences. Yet when the organizations and other structures in which we make our choices encourage us to displace the adverse consequences on others, we also reap only the benefits that then to say that we are ultimately responsible for the consequences of our actions, a little more than a philosophical abstraction. So he's saying when you operate kind of like the as a cog in a wheel, you are absolved, I think it would be the good word, of any responsibility. You're absolved for if you do something that is wrong, it's not your fault. This is you're within an authoritarian structure. There's a good, really famous study and book written on this, which is the Milgram experiments. The Milgram experiments with people, which would be illegal to do now, but with people where they were told that they were giving shocks um, behind to other people in another room. So they had a scientist, like a big scientist, telling the people, "Hey, go ahead and issue a shock to another person that's in this other room. You can hear what they're saying, and you're gonna up the dose." And they would just say, "Hey, up the dose of the shock." Another person says, "Oh, it kind of hurts," and they're like, "Yeah, keep on doing it. Do another shock." And sometimes the people would turn it all the way up to where the person in the other side would act like they're dying. And what they found is that it's essentially like the vast majority of people will go ahead and do the shocks. Now, there was no threat to the person. They could stop when they wanted. They didn't tell them, "Hey, you're not going to get paid if you leave now." None of that. And I guess what was when in the book about those experiments, what the uh, the rationale was, in a hierarchy, people absolve themselves of moral responsibility. They become more immoral because they just basically say someone told me to do it. So hey, it's my job. And they have less guilt about it and everything. So you can use this as an argument. This is really what he's saying here. It's really an argument against hierarchies as far as moral responsibility. He's going to develop some of this. Self-governing enterprises would in principle eliminate and surely would in practice vastly reduce the adversarial and antagonist relations between employers and employees that foster moral irresponsibility on both sides. Every employee would have a stake in the firm's welfare. This is the big one. Being far more numerous and closer to the average citizen than managers and owners, employees would be more representative of consumers and citizens, whereas top managers are a minuscule proportion of the public and can more easily escape or absorb the social costs of their decisions. Employees are much larger and more representative of part of the public as consumers, residents, and citizens. They are therefore much more likely than managers to bear some of the adverse consequences of their decisions, right? Smaller hierarchy or flatter hierarchy, more consequence bared on the individual, right? So, any questions so far? Because this section here is going to be involved. I'm going to keep going. All right. If property is distributed in a highly unequal fashion, a conflict will tend to arise between democracy and property rights. The obvious Republican solution was to ensure somehow that the property be distributed more or less evenly. In the United States, the ideology of agrarian democratic republicanism promised a unique form of that solution. So it sounds kind of weird when you hear about republicanism saying or being concerned about, ooh, the property must be distributed more or less evenly. Well, the assumption here earlier they talk about it in the book, but the assumption here is that if there isn't economic equality, more or less, there's going to be political inequality. And so when he's reasoning, when Jefferson is reasoning, and some of the other kind of founders of the United States, they're starting from the assumption that there's going to be trouble if everything if there's going to be inequality economically. And then, but they said, well, we have all this land and the property is going to be distributed more or less evenly. And this was a Republican argument because things are going to be distributed more or less evenly. We don't have anything to worry about as far as political equality and inequality. We're gonna be able to achieve it, right? Now he's going to come and say that assumption was good 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. It's not good now. The new social and economic order that gradually replaced the American agrarian society in the course of the 19th century did not spontaneously generate the equality of conditions so sharply emphasized by Tocqueville as a fundamental characteristic of American agrarian society, right? So we talked about this before. Basically, farmers, people that own land, people were basically independent contractors. They weren't working in big businesses with big hierarchies. Even over 100, even 100 years ago, or in just the late 19th century, they were not doing that. So what's going on? You know, what's going to happen? What are the repercussions of that? Well, we have corporate capitalism. You have basically the political inequality because of economic equality. Why? Because uh, with the economic inequality, there's a select few who are able to basically pay people off. You could just say, right? So clearly, a solution to the classical Republican problem could no longer depend on the accidental existence of a factor like land. It was mainly exogenous to the political process. In a system where wealth and income were allocated unequally through the institutions of market oriented capitalism to maintain a distribution of political resources favorable to political equality, would require that economic resources be either somehow divorced from political life or else massively reallocated, right? So corporate capitalism does seem to require allocating great financial rewards to property owners. In the United States, given the concentration of ownership, these rewards accrue mainly to a small minority of investors. As a consequence, American society seems to require economic inequalities more extreme than Jefferson could have ever thought possible or permissible among a people with democratic aspirations. So that's a reoccurring argument he has throughout the book that corporate capitalism is not really compatible with political equality. Any questions so far? Getting close to the end here.
No,
So go ahead. Oh yeah. Um, it's reasonable to suppose, however, that members of self-governing enterprises would maintain wage and salary differentials within their firms at much lower ratios than the 10 to 1 or even 20 to 1 that exists in American firms. So this book was written a while ago. So it's 300 to 1, 250 to 1 now, right? Um, So he's saying that when we're under the category of moral responsibility, and as an argument for what he's calling self-governing firms, cooperatives, basically, one of the arguments as far as a moral argument for it is coming at it from the standpoint of economic equality will support political equality, and that was basically United States historically had that with landowners, and farmers and all of that. Cooperatives naturally have more political equality, or sorry, economic equality, because of these differentials in the wages and salary. Are they're better than a hierarchical firm, right? The worker managed Mondragon cooperatives in Spain have sought from the beginning to limit differentials from exceeding a 3-to-1 range between the highest and lowest earnings. So there's a bunch of cooperatives in Mondragon, and some have more than even the 7-to-1, and then some go uh really low in the ratio, like that one. I think we're near the end of the chapter here. It's gonna be a quick review this time. So the task of regulation and redistribution would be much easier in a system than in a system of corporate capitalism. Like it, as far as a cooperative would be a system with cooperatives or self-governing firms. For one, the initial distribution generated by the enterprises would be much less unequal, right? So if there were much more cooperatives, if everything was a cooperative, much more self-governing, it would be, if you had to regulate, you wouldn't have to do it that much. Full and equal citizenship in economic enterprises would greatly reduce the adversarial and conflictive relationships within firms and indirectly in society and politics at large.